Bar for Bar album reviews. IDK, You See For Yourself. You See For Yourself is the latest album from PG County rapper IDK. This album follows his debut release from 2019, Is He Real, as well as his IDK and Friends tapes. With Is He Real, IDK tackled the idea of God and religion in his own life, while giving us a lot about himself as well. With this album, he goes even further into his past and talks to us about love. This love isn't strictly romantic, but it also includes loving himself, family, and his relationship with love. This album comes in a total runtime of 44 minutes with 17 tracks. Lengthwise, it's just about the right length for me, and honestly, I didn't even realize that there were that many tracks. Given that this album is a follow-up, at least in my mind, to Is He Real, my expectations were pretty high. I knew that we'd be getting an album that followed a concept or some sort of overall theme, but that we'd also be getting some really emotional tracks as well. Before anyone listens to the album, I recommend reading the note that IDK had posted a couple of days before the release of the album, along with his custom Game Boy, which reads, "My album You See For Yourself is about the lack of love in my household, leading to the want for love in my friendships and in women, which turned into the misuse of love with my relationships. This is the result of toxic masculinity instilled in my mind at an early age. Growing up, I always wanted my parents to show me unconditional love, but I only got it when I performed well in school or did something they approved of. Well, I never performed well in school, so that should tell you what you need to know. Growing up, games like RuneScape and Pokemon on Game Boy were my ways to escape reality. I felt happy and safe in these games. I dedicated hours on hours to these games, and this is why I'm so focused on making my own custom Game Boys and games for this album." The album starts off with the intro 301-809-1821, which IDK says is about soundscaping. It definitely does help because it sets the tone for the album, and as the album ends, it's a good track to loop back around to. Right as the track starts, there's what I'm going to assume is a boot up sound from his custom Game Boy, since it sounds a little bit like the boot up sound from the original Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. This track leads into Santa Monica Boulevard. This track comes in pretty strong with a high energy beat and IDK's aggressive rapping to kick things off. In his first verse, he touches briefly on the industry and the people who don't really practice what they preach, but then he also applies it to himself when he mentions how he tells his house guests that he doesn't drink, but then he goes and does it anyways, and as if he's always done it. The second verse is a bit more about where he is currently, and he's giving us evidence that he's dope. I also like how near the beginning of the second verse he says, "Bitch, I get paid when I pass a bar, but got no love for the law," because he mentions later on in the album how his parents wanted him to be like a doctor or a lawyer or something, but then he also did get arrested when he was younger. The next track, Dogs Don't Lie, starts off pretty slow and really picks up around the second verse. This track starts off with IDK saying men lie, women lie, dogs don't lie when they fuck, which at first may sound strange. However, when you take into consideration what he's trying to do with this album, it makes a bit more sense. He's being pretty honest about how we as people can lie to get what we want. In his case, he wasn't taught about love, and that led him to lying and treating women poorly to get things like sex. Things switch up a little bit with the second verse where he gets a little bit meta. He addresses the fact that this album won't necessarily be well received by everyone, and that reviewers will be giving him like a 6 or something like he got on his last album. However, he does acknowledge that his fans are still holding him down, and as long as they've got his back, he'll be fine. This takes us to the shortest track on the album, Truth. At 33 seconds, it's really, in my mind, an extension of Dogs Don't Lie. In fact, when I was first listening to the album, I didn't even realize that it was a separate track because it kind of uses the same beat, and the only change is that IDK's vocals are pitched down. This short track is just about the true intentions that people have when they are doing things. It's pretty straightforward, but I do like it. Next we have Prada Bang, which was also the third single for this project and features Young Thug. At first, I really wasn't feeling this track because it felt kind of generic. However, in the context of the album, it's much better, and I think that's mostly due to how it flows in from Truth and Dogs Don't Lie. And that is another thing that IDK did really well with this project. He manages to make every track flow really well into the next one, even if they've got a completely different sound. This track is mostly just braggadocious and a fun listen overall. I also really like how they did the third verse where IDK and Thugger were just trading bars for a little bit, but to be fair, that's something that I always like, no matter who the two rappers are. Speaking of singles, the next track is the first single for the album, Shoot My Shot, featuring Offset. I love this song. I've been listening to it since it dropped as a single months ago. It's a pretty straightforward track that's addressing the women that he used to try to get at. Back then, they didn't pay him no mind, but now that he's getting money, they've started to come back a little bit. As a single, it was a dope song, but as a song in the album, it makes a lot of sense. He's shown us these types of love that he's experienced, but with this track, he shows that he started to understand that this particular love isn't actually love. And this goes even further with the next track, Red. Red features Westside Gunn, MF Doom, and Jay Electronica, and was honestly the track I was looking forward to the most, because the last time IDK and Doom collabed, it was on Pizza Shop, the extended version from I Was Very Bad, and it was really solid. Unfortunately, we don't get a verse from Doom here, and instead he's only there for a few words on the post-chorus. However, IDK has mentioned that there was a full verse, so we may get that eventually. Maybe there's going to be like a remix or something for it. The gist of this track is IDK's realization that some women are only putting themselves around him because of the money and the things that they can get from him. The only thing that I did not like about this track is Jay Electronica's verse. I did like, however, that this song has its own cover art because it technically released the day before the album dropped as a single. The cover is blue, which is, I'm thinking, in direct reference to a skit from Is He Real, where they're discussing how would you explain the color red to someone who just never knew what the color red was? And how someone can go their entire lives thinking that the color blue was actually called red. With the Jelly skit, we have IDK speaking to someone about how people get jealous of others on social media. It also sounds like they touch a bit on how sometimes people post things to make people feel jealous as well, which I guess might be a thing. Next, we have Puerto Rico with Lucky Day. This track has both of them comparing a woman or multiple women to Puerto Rico, and it really also just keeps talking them up. Following the overall theme of the album, here it sounds like IDK feels like he's finding love and starting to properly understand it. However, the chorus makes it seem like he's been able to see through it, similar to how he's realized that some people are only around him for his money, like on Red. He starts to describe this person as different cities, which makes sense. I mean, you can definitely attribute and associate people with different locations because emotions and how they act. But then he also says, your looks can be deceiving, I thought I knew ya, which I guess could be seen one of two ways. One being legitimate deceit, where he thought they were actually into them, but instead they're not. And the other being something related to the bedroom, because the following lines make it seem like that too. The idea of being deceived can kind of make sense with the next track, Temporary Love. This track has a bit of a skit at the beginning where they're asking, just in general, if women are looking for a replacement of a father figure when they get into a relationship with a pimp. I have no thoughts on this matter, but this also leads into a short vocal performance from Sir, where we get a better look at the deceit that I mentioned, where Sir's like, maybe if I treat her well and treat her really nice, she'll go and tell her friends and they'll go crazy. But in the end, she's really just here for temporary love. Sometimes, people just want to feel something. This brings us to 10 Feet, featuring Mother Marigold and T-Pain. I honestly still don't know how I feel about this track because it's not generally a type of song that I would listen to or enjoy, but I think I like it. I think the biggest point of confliction for me is the bridge, and that's only because of how it sounds, but I do like how it pulls a little bit from Monkey on the Dick from Magnolia Shorty. The rest of the song is cool, I guess, and does make sense to be included again because of the overall theming of the album. I also just like that T-Pain's here. When the album first came out, the features weren't listed, so I didn't know he was on this track, so when I heard him, I was really excited. Next, we have Keto, featuring Sway Lee, Rico Nasty, and City Romaniki. I feel almost the same way with this track as I did with 10 Feet, but less because of the subject matter and more because of the beat, which is interesting because it is a Neptunes produced song. and I would assume that I would have liked it. This song, as well as many others on this album and in past albums, really does sound heavily influenced by Kanye West, and that's just something to note, nothing else about it. It's also interesting because it doesn't quite fit in with the whole love theme of the album, but I think it does make a bit more sense as we start to transition to the rest of the album, because at the end of the track, he switches the chorus to say, "He might take my stepfather's life," which we can only assume to be life. And like I said, this leads really well into the next track, 1995, where IDK is really open about his family life growing up. With the first verse, we hear how he was growing up and he'd see his mother and stepfather constantly fighting and arguing to the point that he would have thought that that was a normal thing. Even eating dinner together as a family was a rarity for them unless they went out to eat. With his second verse, he follows a very similar verse structure where he opens with things that affected him directly. Growing up in an immigrant household is not too far off from what he says here. Getting good grades and getting a job that pays well oftentimes does feel like it's the most important thing to them. As the verse continues, IDK mentions how his mother must have felt when his stepfather cheated on her and how that affected him. He attributes the way that he treated others, IDK I mean, especially women, to what he saw growing up. And this does make sense because we are products of our environments. If all we see when we grow up is the mistreatment of a significant other, it kind of makes sense that that's what we think is normal and what we're supposed to do. Not saying that it is at all, but you know. The track Peloton was a really solid single, but it makes even more sense in the context of the album. Here, IDK has acknowledged by now that the way he has treated people in the past was caused by how he was raised, and he's been making changes in his life to remedy that. It sounds like after some time, he's trying to reconnect with someone that he was really into back in the day, but messed things up with them. And then when he goes and tries to talk to them, they're like, nah. This is another thing about love that isn't really, I guess, directly mentioned, but definitely exists. Just because you feel like you've changed doesn't mean that the other person that's involved is ready and willing to forgive you. It is a bummer, but you also do have to respect others' choices as well. I also did a full breakdown of this track in case you're interested in a more in-depth look at it, so feel free to check that out if you want. The Hey Auntie bit from the end of Peloton leads right into the next track, Hey Auntie, featuring Slick Rick. This track, as well as the next, is pretty heavy, so here's a trigger warning. Here, IDK gives us a look at what his vision of a perfect family and perfect example of love would be. The first two verses are very similar and positive for the most part, and they carry a very similar structure as well. Every morning, the mom would cook breakfast with a smile on her face. The dad's over there reading the newspaper, and they'd all sit down together for about half an hour and have breakfast. Then he'd head out to school and be hella excited because he has Lunchables for lunch. With the second verse, things switch up a little bit. It does carry on the same basic part, and love is still in the movie, but instead of his mom being the director, it switches to his aunt, where he then reveals that he got molested. He follows this up with almost a reasoning for why he mentioned it, which is that he's been bottling this up for too long and hopefully this will help. It's almost like therapy. Before Slick Rick's verse, which is really solid as well, by the way, we have a section where it's basically played in reverse. So if you reverse that section, it's essentially saying that God and love are more or less the same thing, but throwing religion into the equation confuses a lot of people, and they can pretty easily lose the idea of what love is. This then brings us to Cry in Church featuring 7 Streeter. There's a lot of emotions towards the end of this album, and this track is the one that broke me almost immediately with the chorus. All of the things that IDK has mentioned about love and success come together really nicely here. He's basically saying that he'd rather be broke and with other people than be rich and all alone, and that he'd rather be happy on the inside than portraying happiness on the outside. His first verse is a reflection that I'm sure many people can relate to. He opens up a little bit more on the second verse as well, where he reflects on his life growing up, where he was essentially left at home alone when he was 5 and had to basically raise himself. He then goes on to talk about how his mom and how there's these things that he wishes that she had done and that could have possibly made him a better person in his mind. The track ends with Prayer 4 from DMX's Great Depression album, which is honestly really fitting because it's just talking all about love. Then at the very end we get IDK singing Hush Little Baby, which leads right into the album's outro, Closure. On Closure we get the idea that this entire time IDK has been talking directly to his mom, or that the album is just one long voicemail. He starts off by mentioning how his mother emphasized religion and tried to bring him closer to God. However, because so many people disagree on religion, he feels it's more important to focus on something that more people can agree on, and that's the want for love. The mockingbird from the lullaby that he was singing is brought up mostly to represent his innocence, which he feels that she could have done more to protect as well, which, I mean, seeing the Hey Auntie track makes sense. He brings all these things up only to say that it's okay and that he's not mad or upset with her. Overall, this album was really good. I had some idea of what we'd be getting into with this album based on the first few singles that we got, as well as it being a follow-up to Is He Real? With the previous album, we got a lot of information about IDK, and we get even more here. Normally, you wouldn't expect artists to continue telling you all about themselves with their second album, but because IDK doesn't really go too into it, and he just kind of sprinkles it here and there, I feel like there's a lot to work with. And he does it differently enough to keep people engaged. And honestly, there's probably so much more that we'll learn by the time, like basically throughout his career. Like I mentioned near the beginning of this review, this album is most definitely not for everyone. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who liked the majority of the first part of the album, but once it started getting more serious and heavy, they were turned off from it, and I don't blame you. IDK touches on some pretty heavy topics and does it in a way that I feel that even if you can't fully relate to it, you'll have some sort of emotional response. My favorite tracks are Cry in Church, Puerto Rico, Shoot My Shot, Peloton, and 1995, but honestly it's hard to narrow it down because I feel like this album is meant to be listened to in its entirety. I've been following IDK since the release of I Was Very Bad in 2017, and he has yet to disappoint. Every project that he's put out has been intentional and has served a purpose. Even the IDK and Friends projects, where they're not quote-unquote albums. Everything is done well. It might be some time since before we get another album proper from him, but I know we'll be getting loosies here and there just to kind of hold us over till that time comes. That's all I got for this review. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this album and what your favorite tracks are. Also, remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more reviews and content like this. Thank you for watching, and please stay safe out there.